Today is May 17th, 2026, and in the last 72 hours, something happened in the Strait of Hormuz that the official statements are not telling you. That the wire services have flattened into a single misleading paragraph, and that almost every analyst on television has framed exactly backwards. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy seized another vessel near the Greater Tumb area, helicopter fast-roped a boarding team onto the deck, forced a course change toward Bandar Abbas, and then watched as the United States military did something that, on the surface, looks restrained, and underneath looks like the most aggressive repositioning of the year. Because here is the thesis, and I want you to hold it in your head for the next 24 minutes. This was not a successful Iranian seizure. This was Iran walking into a trap it built for itself, and the US response you saw on the news is the smallest, quietest, most public-facing piece of a much larger operational shift that is already underway across the Fifth Fleet's area of responsibility. The headline says Iran seized a ship. The operational reality says Iran just handed Washington the legal, political, and military pretext it has been waiting for since the April escalation cycle. Stay with me, because what I am about to walk you through is not speculation. It is a chronology, platform by platform, decision by decision, and by the time we finish, you will understand why this seizure may turn out to be the worst strategic miscalculation Tehran has made in 18 months. Let me pull the lens back and show you the Iranian assumption that just collapsed in public. For the better part of 3 years, the IRGC Navy has operated under a doctrine that I will describe in plain language. The doctrine assumes that the Strait of Hormuz is an asymmetric environment where small, fast, swarming platforms, the Ashura class, the Paykop 2 and 3 fast attack craft, the Boghammer-derived speedboats, and the IRGCN's helicopter-inserted boarding teams, can apply pressure on commercial shipping without triggering a kinetic U.S. response, because Washington's risk calculus, in their reading, is dominated by oil price stability and election cycle restraint. That assumption has driven every major seizure since the Stena Impero in 2019, through the Advantage Suite in 2023, the St. Nicholas in 2024, and the tanker incidents of 2025. The Iranian planners believed the pattern was stable. They believed the U.S. Navy would shadow, protest, sanction, and de-escalate. They believed the choke point gave them leverage that no carrier strike group could neutralize without months of buildup. And here is where mainstream framing misses the entire story. That assumption was already obsolete before this seizure happened. The April-May force posture changes inside CENTCOM, the rotation of the Nimitz strike group's replacement assets into the Gulf of Oman, the quiet repositioning of MQ-9 Reaper sorties out of Ali al-Salem and al-Dhafra, and the deployment pattern of P-8A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft over the past 6 weeks have already reshaped the operational picture. Iran's doctrine assumed a navy that is no longer the navy actually present in theater. And the seizure you just watched on the news was conducted against a U.S. force structure Tehran has not yet updated its planning against. That is the false assumption. That is the gap. And the consequences of that gap are what the next 20 minutes are about. Now let me show you what this actually means by walking the chronology, because the timing of every U.S. asset movement in the last 72 hours tells a story the press conferences are deliberately not telling. Begin with the seizure itself. Iranian fast craft, operating in coordination with at least one Sea King-derived helicopter from the IRGCN's aviation arm, intercepted the vessel in international waters near the traffic separation scheme southwest of the Greater Tumb. The boarding team moved fast, and that speed matters operationally because it confirms the IRGCN has continued to drill the same playbook used in the St. Nicholas operation. Same approach vectors, same boarding sequence, same helicopter insertion profile. That is intelligence. That is a repeatable signature. And the U.S. Navy now has another data point in a target library that has been quietly growing for 2 years. The vessel was directed toward Bandar Abbas, and the moment it crossed into the 12 nautical mile territorial water claim Iran asserts around Keshem and Hormuz Island, the operational clock started. Within hours, and I want you to pay attention to this sequence, a U.S. Navy destroyer, based on open-source AIS spoofing patterns and the rotational schedule of Destroyer Squadron 50 out of Bahrain, almost certainly an Arleigh Burke-class Flight 2A platform, repositioned to a station roughly 45 nautical miles southeast of the seizure point. That is not a shadow position, that is a launch basket position. And it gets more serious from here, because at roughly the same time the destroyer moved, 2 MQ-9 Reaper sorties were generated out of forward bases in the Gulf, and at least one RC-135 Rivet Joint Signals Intelligence aircraft flew a track along the Omani coast that gave it persistent collection geometry against Bandar Abbas, Bandar Ijask, and the IRGCN headquarters complex. The rivet joint is the piece almost no one is reporting, and the rivet joint is the piece that matters most, because what it does is map every emission, every radar, every command frequency, every encrypted burst transmission coming out of the IRGCN's command and control nodes during the active phase of a seizure operation. Iran just lit up its entire C2 architecture in real time, while a US SIGINT platform was overhead recording it. The real question is not whether Iran seized a ship. The real question is what Iran just revealed about its command structure, its sensor handoffs, its helicopter tasking cycle, and its boarding team communications protocol while doing it. And the answer, based on the flight profiles publicly trackable on ADSB Exchange before those aircraft went dark, is a great deal. Let me show you what this actually means in operational terms. A seizure is not a one-platform event. It is a coordinated kill chain. The IRGCN has to detect the target, classify it, task an interception package, vector fast craft to the approach, generate a helicopter sortie, insert a boarding team, and then hand off command authority to a shore station for the transit to Bandar Abbas. Every one of those steps emits a signature. Radar emissions from the Ghadir class or Fateh class submarines patrolling the eastern approaches, command radio traffic from the IRGCN's 2nd Naval District headquarters at Bandar Abbas, cell network traffic from the boarding team, helicopter transponder behavior, fast-craft engine acoustic signatures picked up by underwater sensor arrays the US Navy has, and that I will not characterize beyond saying they exist. Pull all of that together, run it through the fusion architecture at the Combined Maritime Forces headquarters in Bahrain, and what you get is not just an incident report. You get a targeting quality picture of the entire IRGCN seizure apparatus. And that picture is now in the hands of CENTCOM planners who have been waiting for exactly this kind of operational telemetry. And it gets more serious from here, because the US response was not the destroyer movement. The destroyer movement was the visible, public-facing piece. The actual response is the force posture shift that began roughly 36 hours after the seizure and is still developing as I record this. Open source tracking shows at least 2 KC-135 tankers out of Al Udeid generating sorties on profiles consistent with supporting strike package training, not routine refueling. The USS Gerald R. Ford Strike Group's replacement rotation, which had been operating in the eastern Mediterranean, has assets that can be moved through Suez on roughly 96-hour notice, and the Carrier Air Wing's FA-18EF Super Hornets, paired with EA-18G Growlers, represent exactly the electronic attack and strike capability you would want overhead if you were planning a demonstrative response against IRGCN fast craft pens at Bandar Abbas or the helicopter base at Bandar-e Jask. I am not predicting a strike. I am telling you the pieces are in motion that make a strike option credible within a compressed decision window, and Tehran's planners know it. Pull the lens back further, because the platform reveal is where mainstream framing misses the story entirely. The US capability in the Strait of Hormuz right now is not the capability Iran was deterring against in 2019 or even 2023. The introduction of the Block 3 Super Hornet with its conformal fuel tanks and the APG-79-4 AESA radar gives the Carrier Air Wing a strike geometry that compresses Iranian reaction time inside the strait by roughly 30 to 40% compared to legacy Block 2 aircraft. The MQ-9B Sea Guardian variants, now flying in theater, extend persistent maritime surveillance to ranges that put the entire IRGCN small craft basing infrastructure, Abu Musa, the Tums, Keshem, Larak, and the mainland pens around Bandar Abbas, under continuous coverage. The Constellation-class frigate program is still maturing, but the littoral combat ships forward deployed to Bahrain, paired with the MH-60R Seahawks carrying the AGM-114 Hellfire and the APKWS laser-guided rocket, give the Fifth Fleet a small craft suppression capability that is specifically designed to defeat exactly the swarm attack doctrine the IRGCN has spent 2 decades building. And here is the hidden operational variable. The US Navy has been quietly integrating the Naval Strike Missile onto its surface combatants. The NSM has a range that puts every IRGCN basing facility within the Strait of Hormuz inside a single salvo envelope from a destroyer operating in the Gulf of Oman. That is a structural change in the deterrence math, and it happened in the last 18 months while the Iranian planning establishment was still calibrating against Harpoon-era engagement geometries. Tehran is fighting yesterday's force. Washington is fielding tomorrow's. And the seizure just gave the US Navy a live, real-world demonstration of why the new force structure exists. Let me show you what this actually means for the adversary. The consequence map for Iran is not what the headlines suggest. The headlines treat this as another seizure in a long line of seizures, another data point in a slow-burn pressure campaign, another item for sanctions negotiations. That framing is wrong, and it is wrong in a specific way. The actual consequence map runs across 4 dimensions, and I want to walk you through each one because they compound. First, intelligence consequence. The IRGCN just exposed its full kill chain to US SIGINT and ISR coverage at a moment of maximum activity. Every fix on that kill chain, every command node, every communications protocol, every platform handoff, is now part of a targeting library that did not exist in this resolution last month. Second, legal and political consequence. The seizure occurred under conditions that give Washington a clean diplomatic frame to escalate force posture without triggering the regional partner anxieties that have historically constrained US response options. The Emiratis, the Omanis, and the Saudis have all, in the last 6 months, signaled tolerance for harder US responses to IRGCN actions, and Iran just provided the trigger. Third, economic consequence. The shipping insurance market, Lloyd's of London war risk premiums for transits through the Strait of Hormuz, has already moved, and that move imposes a cost on Iranian-aligned trade flows that is paid by Tehran's clients more than by Western consumers, because alternative routings through the Red Sea and around the Cape remain operationally viable for non-Iranian cargo. Fourth, deterrence consequence. Each successful US demonstration of capability in the Strait of Hormuz raises the cost of the next Iranian seizure, and Tehran's planners now have to model a force structure that includes assets they did not have to plan against 2 years ago. The real question is what Iran was actually trying to accomplish with this seizure, and the honest answer is that the IRGCN's institutional incentives and the broader regime's strategic incentives are no longer aligned. The IRGCN needs to demonstrate operational relevance because its budget, its prestige, and its internal political weight depend on visible action in the Strait. The regime, by contrast, needs to manage an economic crisis, a domestic legitimacy problem, and a sanctions architecture that has tightened steadily through the last fiscal cycle. The IRGCN wants seizures. The regime cannot afford the consequences of seizures. And that internal contradiction is the structural weakness Washington is now in a position to exploit, because every IRGCN action that triggers a costly US response forces the regime to either back the IRGCN publicly, which deepens the economic cost, or restrain the IRGCN publicly, which weakens the institution Tehran depends on for choke point coercion. There is no clean exit. That is the trap, and Iran walked into it on its own initiative. Now let me show you the hidden operational turn the headline missed entirely. While the visible US response was the destroyer repositioning and the public statements out of Manama and the Pentagon, the real turn happened in the rules of engagement and the standing orders for US naval forces operating in the Strait. I will not pretend to have access to classified ROE documents. I do not. But I will tell you that the pattern of behavior visible in open source tracking, the speed of the destroyer response, the persistence of the ISR coverage, the timing of the tanker sorties, the absence of the usual de-escalation language from CENTCOM's public affairs apparatus, is consistent with a posture in which the on-scene commander has been given expanded authority to respond to IRGCN actions without waiting for permission from Tampa or Washington. That is a structural change. That is the kind of change that does not get announced. It gets demonstrated. And the next time the IRGCN attempts a seizure, the response time will tell you whether that change is real. Watch for it. The window is narrow. Pull the lens back one more time, because the larger pattern this confirms is the most important piece. For the last 24 months, U.S. force posture in the Gulf has been evolving toward what defense planners describe as a distributed maritime operations model. The old model concentrated combat power around the carrier. The new model distributes combat power across destroyers, frigates, unmanned surface vessels, MQ-9 and MQ-25 platforms, and forward-based strike aircraft, all networked through the Naval Tactical Grid and the broader Joint All-Domain Command and Control architecture that the Department of Defense has been building toward since 2022. What that means in plain language is that the U.S. Navy no longer needs the carrier to be inside the Strait to apply combat power inside the Strait. A destroyer in the Gulf of Oman, a Reaper out of Al Dhafra, a P-8 out of Bahrain, and a Super Hornet on alert at a partner nation base can together generate a response envelope that did not exist in this configuration 5 years ago. Iran's seizure doctrine was built against the old model. The new model is now operational. And the seizure you just watched on the news was the first major test of that new model in a live Strait of Hormuz scenario. Here's what almost no one is talking about, and I want to leave you with it before we get to the verdict. The next phase of this story is not going to be another seizure. The next phase is going to be the Iranian response to the US response. and Tehran's options are narrower than they have been in years. The IRGCN cannot escalate to mining operations without triggering a coalition response that includes the Royal Navy, the French Marine Nationale, and potentially the Italian and Japanese maritime self-defense components that have been quietly building Gulf presence since 2024. Iran cannot escalate to anti-ship missile launches from coastal batteries without inviting the kind of standoff strike package that the Block 3 Super Hornet and the Tomahawk Block 5 were built to deliver. And Iran cannot de-escalate publicly without conceding the doctrinal failure that this seizure exposed. The regime is boxed. The IRGCN is boxed. And the next move belongs to Washington, not Tehran. That is the inversion. That is the turn. And that is why this seizure may turn out to be the inflection point that the April escalation cycle did not produce. So here is the honest assessment of where the situation stands right now. Iran conducted a seizure operation in the Strait of Hormuz using a doctrine that was built for a U.S. force structure that no longer exists in theater. The visible U.S. response was a destroyer repositioning and a set of public statements. The actual U.S. response was a full activation of the distributed maritime operations architecture that has been quietly built over the last 2 years, combined with an intelligence collection effort that has now mapped the IRGCN's kill chain in unprecedented detail, combined with what appears to be a standing orders shift that gives on-scene commanders expanded authority to respond. Iran walked into a trap of its own making. The regime cannot afford the consequences. The IRGCN cannot afford to back down, and Washington holds the next move. The Strait of Hormuz is not the choke point Tehran thinks it is. It is the proving ground for a U.S. naval architecture that was designed to make exactly this kind of Iranian coercion obsolete. And the seizure of the last 72 hours just gave that architecture its first live demonstration. Watch the next 48 hours closely. Watch the AIS tracks of the destroyers in the Gulf of Oman. Watch the sortie generation rates out of Al Dhafra and Al Udeid. Watch the language coming out of CENTCOM's public affairs apparatus, and watch what is not said as carefully as what is said. Watch Bandar Abbas. Watch the IRGCN helicopter base at Bandar-e-Jask. And watch Tehran's domestic media, because the internal framing of this incident inside Iran will tell you whether the regime is preparing to absorb the consequence or preparing to escalate into a worse one. The pieces are on the board, the clock is running, and the next move is the one that matters. Subscribe and turn on notifications because the next 48 hours may matter more than the last 2 weeks. Drop your prediction in the comments. Does Iran escalate, absorb, or pivot? Stay informed. Stay ahead.